My husband leaned in close at one of New York's most exclusive restaurants. "Try not to embarrass me," he hissed, shoving my handbag under the table with unnecessary force. "The CEO is walking in any second, and he doesn't need to see my unemployed wife dragging me down." I just smiled and took a slow sip of water. He had no idea that the billionaire CEO he was desperately trying to impress was about to walk through those doors, lower his head, and address me with the utmost respect. "My name is Nora. I'm 34, and until tonight I honestly thought my marriage was just going through a rough patch. I didn't realize it was built entirely on a foundation of lies." Before I continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever watched a truly arrogant person dig their own grave in real time, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Despite the soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers, the private dining room at Leonard's felt stifling. Derek, my husband of 5 years, was vibrating with nervous energy. He pulled out a plush velvet chair for his mother, Brenda, and then scurried around the table to do the same for his sister. I stood there, waiting for him to at least acknowledge me, but he just snapped his fingers and pointed at the chair closest to the kitchen door. "Sit, Nora, and put that cheap purse away," he commanded. I slid into the seat, pulling my simple black leather tote onto my lap. It wasn't cheap. It was a custom gift from Italy, given to me by one of my board members, but Derek only recognized gaudy logos and loud brands. To him, I was just a stay-at-home spouse, a failed freelance consultant who barely scraped by to pay for groceries. That was the story he liked to tell, and that was the version I let him believe. It made him feel powerful. Brenda adjusted her heavy string of pearls and let out a loud, mocking scoff. "Derek is right, Nora. You really should have dressed up. Look at you, a plain black dress. You look like you're attending a funeral, not the most important dinner of my son's life. You need to understand the stakes here. Derek is a VP of business development now. He's stepping into elite circles. You should be grateful he even brought you along to experience a place like this." I looked at Brenda. Her entire identity was wrapped up in the fact that Derek was her golden boy. For the last 5 years, she'd been reminding me how I held him back and how he could have married someone with a real career. I just gave her a polite nod. I knew exactly what the stakes were tonight. What Brenda and Derek didn't know was that the Omnitech contract Derek was sweating over had been sitting on my desk for review since Tuesday. Derek kept checking his reflection in his phone screen, smoothing his tie. He'd spent $10,000 on a custom suit for tonight, charged to a credit card he assumed I didn't know existed. He was desperately trying to craft the image of a seasoned corporate executive. He leaned over and gripped my wrist tight. "Listen to me, Nora. When Leo arrives, you don't speak unless you're spoken to. Don't talk about your little freelance projects. Don't talk about our house. Just smile and nod. If he asks what you do, tell him you manage our household. Got it?" I pulled my wrist away from his grip, keeping my voice incredibly calm. "I understand perfectly, Derek. You want me to be invisible?" Brenda slammed her water glass onto the table, the ice rattling sharply. "Don't use that tone with him. He is under immense pressure. Do you have any idea how hard he works out there while you sit at home doing nothing? He carries the entire financial burden of this home. You should be thankful he doesn't charge you rent to live in that beautiful house of his." I bit the inside of my cheek, fighting back a laugh. Financial burden. It was such a ridiculous turn of phrase. Derek's salary was decent, but he burned through money as fast as he made it, all on luxury cars, watches, and high-end country club memberships, just to keep up appearances. The only reason we lived in that beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn was because I'd paid for it in full with cash long before we were married. But Derek had convinced his family he was the sole provider and that I was a charity case. I let him keep the illusion because I thought peace was more important than winning an argument. But tonight, peace wasn't an option. "You're absolutely right, Brenda," I said quietly. "Derek works incredibly hard at maintaining his image." Derek shot me a glare, his jaw tight. "I'm warning you, Nora. Omnitech is a billion-dollar unicorn. If I land this partnership, I'm looking at a massive promotion and stock options. My entire future depends on Leo seeing me as an equal. Don't ruin this for me because of your own pathetic insecurity." "I'm not insecure, Derek," I replied, taking a slow sip of my seltzer. "I just want to make sure you actually know what you're doing." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I've been analyzing Omnitech for months. I know everything about their operations. The only thing I don't know is the identity of their anonymous majority shareholder. But once I connect with Leo, I'll find that out too. He was so proud of his corporate espionage. He had no idea that the anonymous majority shareholder he was talking about was sitting right across from him, having just been told to hide her purse. Just then, the heavy oak doors to the private room swung open. Derek launched himself out of his chair, a fake, over-the-top smile plastered across his face. He smoothed his jacket, rushed forward, and extended his hand. "Mr. CEO, it is truly an honor," he began, his voice dripping with syrupy, nauseating sweetness. But the moment Derek saw who was actually standing in the doorway, his smile vanished. It wasn't the billionaire tech genius he was waiting to worship. It was Jamal. Jamal was my sister-in-law's husband, a textbook finance bro. As an aggressive climber in the brutal hierarchy of a Manhattan brokerage firm, Jamal never missed a chance to remind everyone exactly how much money he managed. He swaggered into the room, adjusting his cuffs to ensure his massive gold Rolex caught the light from the chandelier. He looked at Derek with a smug, arrogant grin, ready to begin his own little circus of humiliation. Jamal walked toward the table with a leisurely pace. He loved an audience. Derek took a deep breath, clearly disappointed that it wasn't the billionaire, but he quickly masked it with a forced laugh. "Jamal, my man, you made it," Derek said, patting him on the shoulder. Jamal didn't even look at Derek. His eyes were already locked on me. He pulled out the chair next to Brenda and sat down heavily, planting his elbows on the table so the gold Rolex reflected the light perfectly. He tapped the watch face with his thick fingers. "Just wrapped up a massive portfolio restructuring for a client in Dubai," Jamal announced in his booming voice, which echoed through the private room. "They gave me a bonus, so I figured, why not upgrade the wrist game? Like it, Derek? This watch is worth more than your entire annual bonus if you even manage to get one this year." Derek swallowed hard, his fake smile faltering for a second. "That's incredible, Jamal, truly impressive." Brenda looked at her son-in-law, beaming. "We are so proud of you, Jamal. You're a wonderful provider for my daughter, a true elite in the financial world." She shot me a pointed, vicious glare. "Not everyone understands the pressure that men like you and Derek face." Jamal leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head. He looked at me with pure disdain. "It's a brutal world, Brenda. You have to be aggressive, you have to be a shark." He paused, locking his eyes onto mine. "Speaking of which, Nora, how is that little freelance consulting gig going? Did you make $500 this month? Or are you still just pretending to work on your laptop all day?" I kept my expression completely neutral. "I'm doing just fine, Jamal," I answered calmly. "My projects keep me very busy." He let out a loud, obnoxious laugh that made a nearby server flinch. "Busy? Right. Listen to that, Derek. She's busy." Jamal shook his head in mock pity. "Man, I don't know how you do it. Carrying the weight of a mortgage, car payments, and raising a wife who thinks sending a few emails counts as a career. You're a saint, Derek. If my wife tried that, I would have cut her credit cards off years ago." Derek puffed out his chest, clearly satisfied by the validation. "It's not easy, Jamal. I carry a lot on my shoulders. I just wish she understood how the real corporate world works. That's why I brought her tonight, so she can see what true success looks like when Leo gets here." Brenda reached out and patted Derek's hand. "You're too good to her, dear. You always have been. She's incredibly lucky to have you, living rent-free." I took another sip of water, enjoying the absolute absurdity of the conversation. Jamal was just a mid-level broker at a firm that was currently drowning in high-risk margin loans. I knew this because my venture capital fund, Apex Horizon, held the notes for a huge portion of his company's debt. He was bragging about a Rolex while sitting on a financial landmine I could detonate with a single phone call. And Derek was playing the role of the exhausted provider, all while secretly piling up fraudulent debt on a house that was technically in my name, and he was already in way over his head. They were both clowns performing in a circus I was funding. "I am truly very lucky," I said, my voice carrying a cold sweetness they were too arrogant to notice. "It's so entertaining to hear you both talk about high-level finance. It's truly educational." Jamal smiled smugly, taking my sarcasm for genuine submission. "Glad you're taking notes, Nora. Maybe you'll learn something. You see, in our line of work, we don't wait for handouts. We take what we want. We dominate." Just then, the door to the private room opened again, and the head sommelier entered with a leather-bound wine list. He nodded politely toward the table. "Good evening. While you wait for your final guest, may I offer you some selections?" Before Derek could even reach out, Jamal grabbed the list from the sommelier. Oh, we are definitely drinking tonight, Jamal announced, flipping to the most expensive section at the back. Since Derek is about to land his tech contract and become a big shot, I think we need to celebrate properly. Jamal's finger traced the vintage list. When he looked up at me, his eyes flashed with malice. He wasn't just ordering wine, he was setting a trap. I could clearly see the idea forming in his mind to humiliate me further. We'll take the Chateau Margaux, Jamal said, pointing to a bottle. Bring two. We need to make sure everyone has plenty to drink. The sommelier nodded professionally. An excellent choice, sir. I will bring those right away. As the sommelier left the room, Jamal leaned across the table, his gold watch clinking against his glass. Those bottles are about $2,000 each. Nora, since Derek works so hard to keep a roof over your head, it's only fair you pay for the wine tonight. Consider it your contribution to the family. Or does your pathetic freelance budget not cover it? Diana, please, Bradley pleaded, tears of pure panic streaming down his face, completely abandoning any shred of his former arrogance. Please, honey, you have to help me. You have to talk to him. Mr. Montgomery needs this merger to go through. My promotion depends on it. My entire bonus is riding on this. We're a team. We're married. Just get Leo to sign those documents. Please, Diana, save my career. I'll do anything. I looked down at the man who had spent years chipping away at my spirit to inflate his own pathetic ego. The man who just moments ago had tried to humiliate me in front of Chicago's elite. I didn't feel a single ounce of pity. I leaned down slowly, peeling his sweaty, desperate fingers off my dress one by one. I stepped close, letting the scent of my expensive, understated perfume wash over him, and whispered directly into his ear. You said this table was reserved for important people, I said softly. You can go. I straightened up, turning my back on him without a second glance, and hooked my arm through Leo's. As we turned to head toward the private VIP suite at the back of the restaurant, Mr. Montgomery finally snapped. The senior executive slammed his fist onto the table, completely disregarding the shattered plates and spilled red wine. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Bradley, who was still left kneeling in disgrace on the floor. You absolute imbecile, Mr. Montgomery roared, his voice echoing through the opulent restaurant, drawing the gaze of every wealthy patron in the building. You get this mess cleaned up by tomorrow morning, Bradley. You get on your knees and beg for her forgiveness. Or you're terminated. Do you hear me? Terminated. The next morning I stood in my kitchen, watching the espresso machine drip rich, dark coffee into my favorite ceramic mug. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the pristine marble countertops. It was a beautiful, crisp Chicago morning. The absolute stillness of the house was a stark contrast to the total meltdown that had occurred 12 hours prior. Bradley had slunk in through the front door around 3 a.m, reeking of stale alcohol and panic. He'd locked himself in the guest room without a single word. I had slept like a baby. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter, roasted aroma. Just then, the heavy oak front door was suddenly shoved open. The massive thud echoed through the foyer. I didn't flinch. I knew exactly who had the door code and the audacity to barge in uninvited. Heels clicked aggressively against the hardwood floors, followed by the heavy, dragging footsteps of someone who had never worked a day of real labor in his life. Patricia marched into the kitchen, her face tight with a mix of residual humiliation and aggressive entitlement. Following close behind her was Spencer, Bradley's 28-year-old brother, chronically unemployed, and currently wearing a designer tracksuit I knew Bradley had paid for. He reeked of expensive cologne and unearned arrogance. Bradley trailed behind them, looking like a whipped dog. His eyes were bloodshot, his shoulders slumped. He was hiding behind his mother, hoping she would resolve the catastrophic wreck he had made of his career. I expected him to grovel. I expected Bradley to fall to his knees, just as Mr. Montgomery had ordered. But Patricia was a master of delusion. She slammed her expensive designer handbag onto my clean kitchen island. Diana, we need to have a serious talk, Patricia commanded, her voice sharp and controlling, as if last night hadn't happened. You have been hiding a massive secret from this family. Letting my son think you were struggling financially while you were hoarding billions is nothing short of financial abuse. We were completely in the dark. But we are a forgiving family. We are willing to overlook your deceit if you can make things right today. I took another sip of coffee and arched an eyebrow. Make things right, I repeated, my voice devoid of emotion. Spencer let out a scoff, leaning against the refrigerator with his arms crossed. Yeah, Diana, you owe us. Since your secret billionaire brother is the big boss at Apex AI, you call him right now. Tell him I want his director of operations role at HQ. I need a corner office, full corporate benefits, and a starting salary of at least $400,000. I also want a massive signing bonus. My gaming streams aren't making any money, and it's time you actually helped your family." Patricia nodded forcefully, affirming her youngest son's absurd delusion. "Exactly. Spencer deserves an executive role. He is extremely gifted. And as for Bradley, you call Mr. Montgomery immediately. You tell him that Vanguard Holdings guarantees the merger goes through on the condition that Bradley is promoted to senior vice president. Furthermore, you will arrange for Bradley to receive a massive block of free equity in the new venture. After you publicly humiliated him in front of his boss, it is the absolute least you can do. You owe your husband that financial security." I set my coffee mug down. The suffocating audacity of this group was bordering on clinical. They had spent years stepping on my neck, mocking my background, and treating me like an unpaid servant. The moment they realized I owned the very land they were standing on, they demanded I carry them on my back. "Are you all completely insane?" I asked calmly. "Your son mocked me, tried to publicly humiliate me, and nearly tanked his own company because of his massive, fragile ego. And last night at the restaurant, you all sat there laughing, watching him try to make me pay a bill he knew I couldn't afford. Now you barge into my home demanding executive titles and free equity?" Patricia's face turned a dangerous shade of purple with rage. She slapped her hands flat against the marble countertop. "How dare you speak to me that way in the house I provided for you?" Patricia shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly into my face. "You ungrateful little brat. I bought this house for you too. I provided the down payment. I elevated you from a penniless gardener into a decent suburban wife. Without the foundation this family gave you, you would be absolutely nothing. I pulled you out of the gutter. You owe this family everything." I stared at her, letting her desperate, screeching lies echo in the quiet air of the kitchen. Bradley kept his eyes on the floor, absolutely refusing to make eye contact with me. He knew the truth, but his mother's gaslighting had always been his favorite shield. I turned away from them. I walked straight past the pantry to a framed botanical print hanging on the wall. I pushed aside the heavy wooden frame, revealing a digital keypad embedded in the drywall. I entered a 6-digit code. The heavy steel door of the hidden wall safe clicked open. Bradley let out a confused, stifled gasp. He had lived in this house for 5 years and never knew that safe existed. I reached in and pulled out a thick legal document pouch. I walked back to the kitchen island and slammed the original notarized property deed next to Patricia's designer handbag. "I paid for this house in full with cash before we were even married," I declared, my voice dropping to a deadly cold whisper. "My name is the only one on the original title. I let Patricia think she helped because Bradley begged me to protect his fragile ego. But did Bradley tell you that 3 months ago, he secretly took out a massive second mortgage on this house behind my back to fund his lifestyle?" The truth hit Patricia like a physical blow. Her jaw dropped, her perfectly lipsticked mouth forming a stiff, shocked circle. She snapped her head toward her golden boy, her eyes filled with frantic, desperate denial. The entire foundation of her pride, the narrative she constantly bragged about at the country club, that her wealthy son had bought a mansion for his poor wife, was a complete and utter lie. Bradley hadn't saved me. He was drowning, and he had been using my assets as a life raft to keep his own head above water. "A second mortgage?" Patricia gasped, the air rushing out of her lungs. "Bradley, tell me she's lying. Tell me you didn't forge documents to take out a loan on a house that doesn't even belong to you." Bradley backed away from the island, holding up his hands in frantic, trembling gestures. He looked like an animal cornered, desperately searching for an exit. "Mom, listen to me," he stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "It was just a temporary cash flow issue, a short-term bridge loan. I made some aggressive investments that didn't pan out, but I planned to pay it off the second the Apex AI merger went through and my executive bonus hit." Spencer waved his hands in the air, his face twisting into a sudden outburst of vicious anger. "Wait, so you're broke?" Spencer shouted, his earlier entitlement instantly transforming into rage. "You promised to fund my gaming rig setup next month. You promised me $50,000 for equipment and marketing. You said you had a massive, endless cash flow." Bradley turned to his brother, his panic morphing into a desperate cruelty. "Grow up, Spencer. I'm already deep in debt trying to keep up appearances for Mom's ridiculous social circles and your lazy, unemployed lifestyle. I don't have a single cent to give you. I'm tapped out. Patricia clutched her chest, beginning to hyperventilate as reality collapsed. Her VP son, the man she claimed had saved me from the gutter, was a complete fraud. But her toxic pride absolutely refused to let her blame him. She spun around to face me, desperation and malice flashing in her eyes. "You pushed him to this," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You hid your wealth from him. You forced him to take out loans to maintain status because you were too selfish to support your own husband. This is all your fault." Before I could even respond to her pathetic attempt at gaslighting, the heavy oak front door was shoved open again. Steady, confident footsteps echoed down the hallway, moving with a measured, unhurried pace that stood in sharp contrast to Patricia's frantic stomping and Spencer's lazy dragging. Jamal walked into the kitchen. He was 35, tall, athletic, and wearing an impeccable custom charcoal suit that made Bradley's expensive but wrinkled clothes look pathetic. As the African-American husband of Bradley's sister Megan, Jamal had spent the last 7 years enduring the endless, thinly veiled racism and class-based microaggressions of this unbearable family. Despite having a master's degree in cybersecurity from MIT, Patricia still treated him like the household handyman, demanding at every Thanksgiving dinner that he fix her Wi-Fi router or set up her printer. Bradley always introduced Jamal to his corporate friends as Megan's husband who works in IT, intentionally diminishing Jamal's actual career to bolster his own sense of superiority. Jamal had borne their blatant disrespect in silence for years, fully aware that his intelligence, character, and net worth dwarfed theirs by a country mile. Patricia immediately shifted her frantic panic toward the newcomer, eager to reassert her dominance over someone she considered inferior. "What are you doing here?" she shrieked, her face twisting in ugly, naked disdain. "This is a private family crisis. Who let you in? We don't need help standing around eavesdropping on our financial situation. Get out of my son's house immediately, or I'm calling the police to report you for trespassing." Jamal didn't flinch. He didn't stop walking. He didn't even look at Patricia. He marched straight past her, treating her with the same absolute, dismissive silence that Leo had treated Bradley with the night before. He bypassed Spencer, who instinctively shrank back from Jamal's commanding, unbothered aura, and walked straight to me at the kitchen island. "Good morning, Diana," Jamal said, his deep, resonant voice effortlessly cutting through the chaotic, high-pitched shrieking of my in-laws. "Megan sends her love. She decided to stay in the car. She said she simply couldn't stomach looking at her mother's or her brother's face today." I gave Jamal a genuine, relaxed smile, the first truly warm expression I had shown all morning. In this toxic family, Jamal had been the only person to ever show me genuine respect. We had silently bonded as fellow outsiders, sitting in the corners and observing the utterly ridiculous antics of people who truly believed they were better than us. Bradley lunged forward, his face flushed red with panic and rage, pointing an aggressive, shaking finger at Jamal. "You have no place here, Jamal. You work in my company's IT department. I'm a VP. I will have you fired by noon for trespassing on my property and harassing my family." Jamal finally turned, locking his calm, lethal gaze onto my husband. "First of all, Bradley, I don't work in your IT department. I am an independent senior cybersecurity auditor contracted directly by your board of directors to monitor corporate compliance. I report to the chairman, not to mid-level management. Secondly, you don't own this property. We just heard Diana prove that." Bradley swallowed hard, the color draining from his face as the truth of Jamal's actual title finally registered in his panicked brain. Jamal turned his attention back to me, his expression turning deadly serious. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. Patricia was still in the background, roaring for respect, demanding that someone call security. But her voice faded into meaningless background noise against the heavy, crushing pressure of what Jamal was about to do. Over the last 48 hours, he had stayed up late using his high-level security clearance and forensic accounting software to dig deep into Bradley's company's encrypted servers. He had bypassed firewalls, tracking hidden digital breadcrumbs Bradley thought had been deleted forever. Jamal pulled his hand from his pocket. Between his fingers was a sleek, heavy, matte black USB drive. The small metal device glimmered under the bright recessed lighting of the kitchen. He dropped it onto the marble kitchen island. It made a crisp, decisive clack, landing right next to the original property deed and Patricia's designer handbag. The sound made Bradley physically jump, as if a gunshot had gone off in the room. "Diana," Jamal said, his voice ringing with absolute devastating clarity. "I audited Bradley's corporate and personal accounts. I'm sorry it took me so long to bring the evidence to you." I picked up the matte black drive. It felt impossibly heavy, loaded with a digital death warrant for my husband's entire way of existence. Bradley lunged, his hands clawing frantically toward the marble island, trying to snatch the device from my grasp. He didn't even make it halfway. Jamal smoothly slid into his path, grounding his feet and crossing his arms. Jamal was a weekend marathon runner. Bradley's weekends consisted of drinking and golfing. When Bradley slammed into Jamal's chest, he was repelled like a paperweight hitting a brick wall. "Get away from me!" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking from pure terror. "That is stolen company property. You'll go to federal prison for this, Jamal. I'll sue you." Jamal looked down at him without a hint of emotion. "I am a federally registered auditor, Bradley. I have full authorization to extract these files. The only person facing federal charges today is you." I turned my back on the pathetic scuffle, walking out of the kitchen with a calm, rhythmic stride toward our expansive living room. The massive 85-inch smart TV dominated the far wall. Patricia and Spencer scrambled to follow me, their previous rage completely eclipsed by a sick, greedy curiosity. They still believed Bradley was a financial genius who had just made a minor mistake. They wanted to see the numbers. They wanted to know how much more wealth they could squeeze out of him once the dust settled. I plugged the drive directly into the port on the side of the TV screen. I grabbed the remote and navigated to the external input. The screen went black for less than a second before mirroring the contents of the drive. The resolution was crystal clear. The screen was filled with dozens of meticulously organized folders. Jamal had categorized everything with ruthless efficiency. I clicked on the folder labeled Hidden Liabilities and Offshore Transfers. A massive spreadsheet opened, full of highlighted rows detailing wire transfers through Cayman Island shell companies and Delaware LLCs. Patricia leaned in, squinting at the screen. "What is all of this?" she demanded. "These are just business expenses. My son manages high-level corporate assets." "These are not corporate assets," I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the quiet living room. "Look at the source account, Patricia." I highlighted a specific column. The routing numbers matched our joint savings account perfectly, the account where I deposited my meager freelance earnings to maintain my cover, while Bradley claimed he was saving for our future. For over 2 years, he has been systematically siphoning funds from our joint assets, I explained, my tone entirely clinical. He funnels money through shell companies to hide it from me, as well as the IRS. He is buried under millions in hidden debt, taking out high-interest loans to cover the losses from his disastrous stock market bets. Bradley was hyperventilating in the hallway, trying to push past Jamal but completely unable to move the larger man. "Turn it off," Bradley begged, his voice degrading into a pathetic whimper. "Diana, please turn it off. We can settle this privately. Don't do this in front of them." I completely ignored him. I exited the spreadsheet and opened the next folder titled simply Real Estate Holdings. A high-resolution scan of a property deed appeared on the massive screen. It detailed a penthouse in one of the most exclusive, expensive high-rises in downtown Chicago. Patricia gasped, clutching her hands together. Her face shifted from panic into pure, unfiltered greed. "Oh, Bradley, you clever boy," she exclaimed, pointing triumphantly at the screen. "I knew it. You've been secretly investing in real estate. You bought a luxury condo downtown to flip. You see, Diana, he's a financial genius. While you were planting daisies, he was working hard to build a real portfolio." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. It was the first time I had laughed all morning, a sound that made Patricia shrink back. "You are hopelessly blind, Patricia." I turned to look her straight in the eyes. "Read the second-named person on the deed, right under your genius son's name." Spencer stepped closer to the screen, his eyes scanning the fine legal print. He squinted at the dense text. "Who is Vanessa?" Spencer asked, completely unaware that he was about to detonate a bomb. Bradley let out a wounded, choked sound from the hallway. "Vanessa is not a real estate partner," I declared, staring daggers at Bradley. "Vanessa is a 24-year-old fitness instructor. She is his mistress." Patricia froze. Her hand hung in midair pointing at the screen, her mouth hanging wide open in absolute shock. I clicked on a subfolder containing bank statements and credit card receipts. The screen filled with undeniable evidence. For 2 full years, Bradley has been fully funding a lavish lifestyle for his mistress. He uses the money he steals from our joint account to pay her rent, buy her a sports car, and take her on luxury vacations to the Bahamas, all while telling me he's attending corporate executive retreats. That condo isn't an investment property at all, it's a fully funded love nest. He drained all the equity out of his assets, secretly took out a second mortgage on this house behind my back, and committed corporate fraud, all just to appease a girl 12 years his junior. The silence in the living room was absolute. Patricia looked like she was about to physically vomit. Her perfect, successful VP son wasn't just broke. He was a lying, cheating, embezzling fraud who had squandered their family reputation on a secret double life. Bradley finally cracked. His carefully constructed, arrogant facade was completely shattered, and the pure terror that followed sent him into a beast-like, desperate panic. He ducked under Jamal's arm, crawling frantically into the living room. He no longer cared about his tailored suit or his dignity. He rushed toward the TV, stretching out his hands, desperate to yank the drive from the slot and destroy the evidence. "You can't do this to me!" Bradley screamed, his shoes slipping frantically on the polished hardwood floors. "I won't let you ruin my life!" He lunged at the screen, his fingers clawing frantically at the side panel, looking for the small metal drive. But in his blind panic, his hand slammed into the TV bezel, knocking the remote off the media console. The remote hit the floor, and the impact inadvertently pressed the play button. Bradley grabbed the flash drive and yanked it out in one violent motion. He stood there, gasping for air, clutching the device to his chest. A manic, triumphant grin spread across his sweating face. But the damage was done. The media player on the smart TV had already buffered the next file in the queue. As Bradley stood there clutching the disconnected drive, the massive surround sound speakers in our living room erupted. An audio file began playing automatically, broadcasting at maximum volume. It was a phone recording. The audio was crystal clear, captured directly from Bradley's company phone data cache by Jamal's professional auditing software. Bradley's voice filled the room, sounding relaxed, arrogant, and incredibly cruel. He was on the phone with his mistress, Vanessa. "I know, baby, I know." The recorded version of Bradley laughed. "I'll get to the condo as soon as I can. I have to deal with my mother first. She's always asking me for money. Honestly, she's just a gold-digging hag who treats my bank account like her personal lottery. I'm so tired of pretending to respect her." Patricia let out a sound of pure, muted horror, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. The color drained from her face entirely. "My brother is even worse," recorded Bradley continued, his voice dripping with pure disgust. "Spencer is a complete useless parasite. He sits there wearing expensive tracksuits pretending to be an influencer while he sucks my wallet dry. As soon as this merger goes through and I get my executive bonus, I'm cutting them both off for good. They're pathetic leeches and I'm done dragging them along." Bradley froze in front of the television, the disconnected flash drive slipping from his trembling fingers and clattering onto the floor. The sharp sound of metal hitting hardwood seemed to break the spell that had held the room captive. Patricia stepped forward slowly, shaking all over. Her perfect suburban facade was shattered, leaving behind a hollow, broken old woman. The son she worshipped, the man she boasted about to every member of the country club, had just called her a gold-digging hag. She raised her hand, her diamond ring refracting the ambient light, and slapped Bradley across the face with everything she had. The sound of the slap cracked through the expansive living room like a whip. Bradley staggered backward, clutching his rapidly reddening cheek, his eyes a mix of shock and terror. "How dare you?" Patricia hissed, her voice trembling with a level of vitriol I had never heard her use. "I gave you everything, I defended you, I bragged about you to everyone we knew, and you called me a parasite while spending millions on some fitness instructor." Before Bradley could come up with a pathetic excuse, Spencer lunged. The insult about being a useless parasite had hit a nerve deep in his fragile, unearned self-esteem. Spencer tackled his brother at the waist, slamming his shoulder directly into Bradley's chest. Both grown men crashed backward into my custom glass coffee table, shattering the top into thousands of shimmering shards. It was a pathetic, chaotic brawl. Designer suits were torn, fists were swinging wildly. Spencer threw disorganized punches, screaming about his ruined gaming career and the money Bradley owed him. Bradley fought back with frantic, desperate shoves, trying to protect his face while slipping on the polished wood floor. Blood from Bradley's split lip smeared onto his pristine white collar. They were no longer the arrogant, superior men of this house. They were beasts tearing at each other over the scraps of their completely destroyed self-esteem. I remained unmoved. I just watched as this empire of lies burned itself to ash. Jamal stepped smoothly in front of me, using his broad shoulders to shield me from the flying glass and flailing limbs. He didn't raise a fist. He didn't need to. He possessed an inherent, commanding authority that didn't require any physical violence. Enough. Jamal's voice boomed through the room. It wasn't a shout. It was an order delivered with absolute power, by a man who had finally lost his patience. The brothers froze, tangled in the ruins of the furniture, gasping for air. Patricia sobbed into her hands, her perfectly styled hair disheveled over her tear-streaked face. Jamal looked at all three of them with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You people are unbelievable," he said, his voice low and rhythmic. "For 7 years, my wife and I have sat at your dinner table. I watched you turn your noses up at my skin color, my background, and my supposed IT job. You treated Diana like a hillbilly because she'd rather play in the dirt than buy your fake designer bags. You built this pathetic suburban delusion on the idea that you were genetically and financially superior to everyone else." Jamal walked closer to Patricia, who shrank back in fear. "Look at you now," he continued, his tone relentless. "You're nothing but a bunch of hypocrites. Patricia, you worship a son who steals money from his own marriage to fund a mistress. Spencer, you demand an executive salary with 0 skills, expecting the world to place a crown on your head just for existing. And Bradley." Jamal turned his gaze toward my bleeding, gasping husband. "You're the biggest fraud of them all. You embezzle company funds. You steal from your wife. You sell out your own flesh and blood just to feel like a big man in a downtown condo. The only real people in this room are the ones you thought were beneath you." I stepped out from behind Jamal, feeling a profound, absolute sense of relief. My meticulously decorated living room was ruined, but I had never felt cleaner. I looked down at Bradley, who was trying to wipe the blood from his mouth with the back of his torn suit sleeve. "Get out," I said. My voice was perfectly calm, no rage, no sadness, only finality. Bradley blinked, spitting blood onto the floorboards. "Diana, please," he rasped. "I said get out," I repeated, taking a step closer. "All of you, get out of my house. Patricia, take your golden boy and your parasite son and get off my property. You have exactly 5 minutes before I trigger the alarm and have the police remove you for trespassing and destruction of property." Patricia scrambled to her feet, grabbing her designer bag with trembling hands. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Bradley. She practically sprinted to the front door, abandoning her golden boys behind to save herself. Spencer scrambled up behind her, clutching a bruised eye and abandoning his brother without a second thought. The heavy front door slammed shut behind them. Bradley remained on the floor. He stood up slowly, swaying slightly as he processed the reality of his situation. His mother had abandoned him. His brother hated him. His career was imploding, and his secret life was exposed. He was backed into a corner, like a desperate rat with nowhere to run. And like a rat, he bared his teeth. The pathetic, pleading look vanished from Bradley's face. His eyes went dark and wild, consumed by a terrifying, manic greed. He wiped the blood from his chin, staining his hands, and let out a broken, manic laugh. "Fine," Bradley screamed, the sound tearing from his throat. "Fine, I'm leaving. You think you won, Diana? You think you can just kick me out and turn back to your billionaire brother and your massive VC firm? You're forgetting one key detail." He staggered toward me, his chest heaving, his face twisting into a mask of pure, vengeful malice. "This is a 50-50 state," Bradley roared, pointing a blood-stained finger directly in my face. "We are married. I don't care how many companies you secretly founded, and I don't care how much capital you pumped into Apex AI. What's yours is mine. I'm hiring the coldest divorce attorney in this city. I'm taking half of your secret Vanguard Holdings wealth in the divorce. I'm taking half of your billions, Diana. You're going to be paying me for the rest of your life." Bradley stood among the shattered glass of our living room, his chest heaving as his threats echoed off the walls. He didn't flinch. He didn't run to pack his bags. Instead, fueled by the intoxicating delusion of unearned wealth, he pulled his phone from his ruined suit pocket. His hands were shaking, smearing blood on the cracked screen, but his eyes were locked onto mine with a manic, greedy intensity. He paced the floor, barking orders into the receiver, demanding his attorney drop everything and get here immediately. He wanted to strike while the iron was hot, absolutely convinced he had just discovered the ultimate winning lottery ticket. Jamal stepped forward, offering to physically throw him out, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Let him stay," I said calmly. "Let him summon his attack dog. I want to see how this plays out." Less than 40 minutes later, Bradley's legal enforcer arrived. A sleek silver sports car pulled into my driveway aggressively, tires screeching against the pavement. The man who stepped out was the absolute embodiment of predatory corporate law. He wore a pinstripe suit that cost more than my first car and carried a leather briefcase embossed with his initials. He walked into my front door without even knocking, taking in the blood, the shattered coffee table, and the general chaos of the room with an amused, cynical smirk. This was Preston Cole, the city's most notorious divorce lawyer, famous for bleeding spouses dry and leaving them with nothing but legal fees and regret. Apparently, Bradley had been retaining him for months, likely preparing to divorce me and leave me penniless the moment his corporate merger with Apex AI went through. Now, the expensive weapon he had bought to destroy my life was being repurposed to steal my empire. Preston stepped carefully over the broken glass and stood next to my husband. He didn't introduce himself to me. He didn't acknowledge Jamal, who stood silently to the side observing the farce. Preston simply opened his briefcase, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and looked at me like a piece of high-profit meat. "All right, Diana," Preston began, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "My client just informed me of a rather fascinating development. It seems you have been acting in great bad faith throughout the duration of this marriage, concealing massive income sources, operating shell companies, and keeping a billion-dollar venture capital firm hidden from your legal spouse. That is the textbook definition of financial fraud." Bradley stood up straighter, a triumphant smirk stretching across his bruised face. He wiped the blood from his chin with a handkerchief, clearly emboldened by his lawyer's aggressive posture. "Tell her exactly how this works, Preston. Tell her what she owes me." Preston chuckled, pacing slowly around my devastated living room. "The laws in this state are beautifully straightforward, Diana. Regardless of whose name is on the holding company, marital assets are marital assets. You thought you were so clever, playing the submissive, quiet little plant shop owner while building a shadow empire behind my client's back. But the reality is that every cent you earned, every share you acquired, and every investment you made during the marriage belongs equally to Bradley." He paused, letting his threat sink in, clearly expecting me to break down in tears. When I offered no reaction, he pressed further, his tone turning vicious. "We will subpoena every record Vanguard Holdings possesses. We will audit your brother's company, Apex AI, to determine the exact valuation of your initial seed capital. We are going to drag your entire secret financial network into the blinding spotlight of open court. By the time I'm done dismantling your corporate structure, Bradley will have half of your shares, half of your voting rights, and half of your liquid capital. You will be paying him millions in alimony every year, just to maintain his standard of living." Bradley laughed out loud, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Did you hear that? I'm going to take your brother's company right out from under you. You ruined my career tonight, so I'm taking yours. I'll be sitting on your board of directors by next month." I didn't shout. I didn't argue the law. I simply turned my back on both of the gloating men and walked straight into the kitchen. I walked up to the espresso machine. The grinding of the beans made a loud, raucous sound that completely drowned out Preston's continuing monologue about asset division and forensic accounting. I steamed the milk and poured it carefully into my mug. Jamal leaned against the kitchen counter, watching me with a quiet, knowing smile. He knew I would never engage in a fight unless I had already secured the victory. I took a slow, deliberate sip of coffee. The rich, warm taste was nothing short of delightful. I walked back into the living room with the mug in one hand, radiating a sense of total, undisturbed calm. Preston frowned, clearly annoyed that his aggressive scare tactics were bouncing off me like rain on titanium. "Are you even listening to me?" he shouted suddenly, his professional facade cracking. "You are facing total financial ruin. You are about to lose half of $1 billion empire. You would be better off calling your own legal counsel to negotiate a settlement before we freeze every account associated with your name." I took another sip of coffee, savoring the silence that followed his outburst. I walked past Preston. I walked past Bradley. I marched straight into the hallway, heading directly toward the botanical print that concealed my wall safe. I entered the 6-digit code. The heavy steel door clicked open. Preston stood with his arms crossed, watching me. Running to your safe isn't going to help you hide anything, Diana. My legal team will find every document, every gold bar, and every offshore routing number you possess. I ignored him. I reached past the stacks of property deeds and corporate seals. From the very bottom of the safe, I pulled out a faded manila folder. It wasn't a thick stack of files. It was just a few pages of heavy bond paper, signed and notarized 5 years ago. I walked slowly around the shattered glass of the coffee table, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood. I tossed the folder onto the only undamaged piece of furniture in the room, a side table. Before we talk about my assets, I said, my voice cutting through the room with surgical precision. Let's talk about the contract Bradley forced me to sign 5 years ago. Before we talk about my assets, I repeated, my voice cold as ice. Let's talk about the contract Bradley forced me to sign 5 years ago. Bradley scoffed, his bruised face twisting into pure manic confusion. Contract? What contract? He looked frantically at Preston, silently demanding his expensive attack dog do its job and evaporate this new obstacle. Preston didn't respond immediately. He approached the side table with the extreme caution of a bomb squad technician. He flipped open the faded manila cover. The clear, dense legal text inside was unmistakable. It was a prenuptial agreement, bound in heavy blue backing paper, bearing the embossed seal of a prominent local notary. 5 years ago, I explained, my eyes locked on my husband. Bradley had just been promoted to regional manager. He'd just gotten a tiny raise and a modest stock option package. He was terrified that his new wealth would be sucked dry by a woman who played in the dirt all day. He told his mother I was a financial burden. He thought I would drag him down and steal his hard-earned corporate bonuses. Bradley's eyes darted back and forth. I didn't force you to sign that. My mom suggested it. It was just a standard precaution to protect my retirement accounts. It was a masterfully drafted death warrant, I corrected him. You hired an aggressively litigious team to build it. You wanted to ensure it was absolutely bulletproof, so that if our marriage failed, I would never touch a single cent of yours. Preston was reading the document silently, his eyes scanning the dense paragraphs with increasing speed. His cynical smirk vanished completely. His jaw tightened, and a frown creased his forehead. Read it out loud, Preston, I ordered. Read the asset division parameters and let your client know exactly where he stands right now. The cutthroat divorce lawyer cleared his throat. For the first time since he swaggered through my front door, his professional detachment wavered. Section 4, paragraph 2, Preston read, his voice flat and mechanical. All assets acquired, developed, founded, or funded by either party during the duration of the marriage shall remain the sole and exclusive property of the acquiring individual. Corporate equity, venture capital, or real estate holdings shall not be commingled. What is mine is mine. What is yours is yours. Bradley swallowed hard, the last of the color draining from his face until he looked physically ill. Wait, that can't apply to a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm. That was just to protect my personal savings and my corporate stock options. You can't use a standard prenup to hide an entire financial empire. Preston didn't look up from the paper. In fact, Bradley, he said, his tone turning unusually cold, the language used by your attorneys is airtight. It covers all corporate equity and venture capital, with 0 exceptions. She doesn't owe you half of Vanguard Holdings. She doesn't owe you a penny of her business earnings. By forcing her to sign this, you legally insulated yourself entirely from her entire fortune. You built a fortress to keep her out, only to lock yourself out. Bradley staggered backward, his shoulder hitting the wall. He grabbed his hair, leaving smears of dried blood across his forehead. No, he gasped, his chest heaving with panic. No, that contract is 5 years old. A judge can throw it out. We can fight it in court. We can say I was under duress or that the economic disparity is so great it's unenforceable. You are certainly welcome to litigate, I said, taking another calm sip of coffee. But you forgot the most important part of this document, Bradley. You insisted on adding it because you wanted absolute control over me. You were so convinced I would cheat with a landscaper that you demanded a penalty clause. I pointed to the final pages of the contract in Preston's hands. Turn to Section 9, Preston, the morality clause. Preston turned the page. He read the heading, and his shoulders noticeably slumped. He let out a long, heavy sigh. The sound of a man who had just realized he'd wasted an expensive trip across the city for absolutely nothing. Section 9, Preston read, skipping the heavy legalese to deliver the kill shot. In the event of divorce, triggered by proven adultery, infidelity, or the misappropriation of marital funds to sustain an extramarital affair, the offending party shall forfeit any and all rights to challenge this agreement. The offending party waives all rights to alimony, spousal support, and reimbursement of legal fees. They leave the marriage with absolutely no claim to any assets. The silence that blanketed the living room was absolute. Jamal, who had been leaning quietly against the kitchen counter, let out a low, appreciative whistle. "You dug your own grave, man," Jamal said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You bought the shovel, paid for the dirt, and jumped right in." Bradley looked utterly destroyed. His desperate, wide eyes turned to the massive smart TV screen. The spreadsheet documenting his offshore transfers to his mistress was still glowing brightly. The high-res scan of the luxury downtown condo deed in the name of the 24-year-old fitness instructor was still open in the next window. The audio recording of him viciously mocking his mother and brother while planning his next tryst remained as fresh in everyone's memory as it had been moments ago. This evidence wasn't circumstantial. It was forensic-grade, undeniable, and currently stored on the sleek black USB drive sitting on the floor. Preston slowly closed the manila folder. He didn't toss it back on the table. He set it down with extreme care, as if the document were radioactive. He looked at the prenup, then looked up at the TV screen, which displayed the undeniable proof of Bradley's 2-year affair. Finally, he looked at his client. "Bradley," Preston said, his voice completely stripped of the aggressive, predatory arrogance he'd walked in with. "You told me on the phone that your wife was concealing assets and that you were the primary provider. You didn't mention that you forced her to sign an airtight prenup that isolated her wealth entirely. You also didn't mention that you had been misappropriating funds to sustain a mistress, triggering a zero-tolerance infidelity clause that strips away every legal right you might have had to fight this in court." "Preston, please," Bradley begged, holding out his hands in a pathetic gesture of submission. "We can find a loophole. You're the best divorce attorney in Chicago. You can destroy her in litigation. Whatever we get, I'll give you 20%. I'll give you 30%. Just shred that contract." Preston picked up his monogrammed leather briefcase from the floor. With a sharp echo, he snapped the golden latches shut. He straightened his expensive pinstripe suit with extreme precision, smoothing out the wrinkles. "To give you 30%, you first have to win a settlement," Preston said, his tone turning to pure frost. "And to win a settlement, you need a case. You don't have a case. You have a legally binding contract you drafted yourself that explicitly guarantees you leave with nothing. Furthermore, you've admitted to the misappropriation of corporate funds on a recording." Preston walked past Bradley, straight toward the front door. He didn't look back. He didn't offer a polite farewell. "You're a dead man walking," Preston stated coldly, his hand on the brass doorknob. "I don't work for free." The heavy oak door slammed shut behind Preston Cole. The sharp sound echoed through the devastated living room like the final gavel strike of a ruthless judge. Bradley froze in the center of the shattered glass, completely abandoned by the man he thought would save his stolen wealth. The aggressive, predatory lawyer who was supposed to strip away my empire had turned and run the moment he saw the undeniable facts. Jamal pushed off the kitchen counter, letting out a short, barking laugh, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. Bradley stared at the empty doorway, his chest heaving beneath his torn, expensive dress shirt. He looked down at his trembling hands, then back up at the massive smart TV screen, still showcasing the undeniable, forensically proven evidence of his cheating and corporate embezzlement. The heavy reality of complete legal defeat finally crashed down upon him. The prenup he'd forced me to sign to protect his meager savings had just locked him out of a multi-billion-dollar venture capital fortune. But instead of letting his panic drive him to grovel or accept the consequences of his actions, it mutated into a dark, toxic, and completely delusional fury. If the law couldn't help him steal my wealth, he would resort to the only arena where he still believed he held absolute, unquestionable power, the corporate boardroom. Bradley wiped the sweat and smeared blood from his forehead. His posture shifted from defeated slouching to a rigid, aggressive stance. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his eyes burning with manic malice. "You think this is over, Diana?" he roared, his voice trembling with desperation and unbridled arrogance. "You think a piece of paper and a cowardly lawyer mean you won this war? You're forgetting exactly who I am. I'm still the VP of Business Development. I hold the keys to the Apex AI merger. That historic deal doesn't move an inch without my signature and my direct executive approval." I watched him, my expression completely flat. He was grasping at straws, trying to forge a deadly weapon out of smoke and mirrors. Bradley paced the room, his dress shoes crunching loudly against the shattered glass of the coffee table. "Mr. Montgomery is completely dependent on my risk analysis," Bradley boasted, puffing out his chest, raising his voice as if he were barking orders at a room full of subordinates. "I am the absolute gatekeeper for all tech acquisitions in our firm. If I walk into that corner office tomorrow morning and tell Montgomery that Apex AI is a massive financial liability, the deal is dead." Jamal crossed his arms, watching Bradley with a look of pure, unadulterated pity. "You're talking about blatant corporate sabotage just to spite your wife," Jamal said, his low voice cutting through the frenzied rant. "You're talking about intentionally tanking a deal your boss desperately needs." "I'm talking about total destruction," Bradley bellowed, completely ignoring Jamal. He stepped aggressively toward me, his face twisting into a vicious sneer. "I know how this game is played, Diana. I'll tell the executive board that your brother's AI algorithms are complete fabrications. I'll forge serious violations and plant them in the audit files. I'll leak fake internal memos to the tech press, claiming Apex AI was built on stolen IP. By the time I'm done planting the evidence, the SEC will be knocking on Leo's front door." I took a slow, restrained sip of my espresso. Bradley was hyperventilating now, completely drunk on his own delusions of grandeur. He truly thought he was a titan of industry who could move mountains. He thought I was just a silent investor who didn't understand the brutal politics of corporate M&A. "Mr. Montgomery has deep connections with all the major VC firms in the country," Bradley continued, a manic gleam in his bloodshot eyes. "He golfs with board members of the biggest tech groups in Silicon Valley. Let me remind you, Diana, at the restaurant last night, he was furious at your arrogant brother. Montgomery felt disrespected. He felt publicly humiliated. He is already looking for a reason to crush Leo. When I hand him this fabricated risk assessment, he will be more than happy to help me burn Apex AI to the ground." Bradley threw his arms open, gesturing to the ruined living room as if he had just conquered a battlefield. "I'll ensure Leo's company is blacklisted across the entire global tech sector. I'll make his proprietary software worthless. You want to protect your little empire, Diana. You want to hide your billions from me and humiliate me in front of my boss. Well, congratulations. You can keep your hidden money, but I'm going to make sure your precious brother loses everything. When his company goes bankrupt, Vanguard Holdings is going to take a massive financial hit. I'll ensure your portfolio bleeds to death on the trading floor." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch or offer a single word of protest. I just watched this pathetic, bleeding man standing in my ruined home, letting him scream his hollow threats into the void. The fact that I showed absolutely no fear seemed to enrage him further. Bradley spun around, grabbing his ruined suit jacket from the back of the sofa. He strode toward the front door, leaving wet, bloody footprints on the pristine hardwood. "You'll deeply regret the day you messed with me," Bradley screamed, ripping open the heavy front door and stepping out onto the porch. "I'm going to ruin your brother. I'm going to ruin everything you've built. By tomorrow afternoon, you'll be on your knees begging me to stop." He slammed the door with such violent force that the expensive picture frames on the walls shook. Seconds later, the aggressive roar of his sports car engine echoed in the driveway, followed by the screeching of tires as he accelerated away, speeding off to plan his fictional corporate revenge. The house went quiet, save for the faint humming of the TV screen showcasing the record of his financial crimes. Jamal let out a long breath, carefully stepping over the shattered glass to stand next to me. "That man is completely delusional," Jamal said, shaking his head. "He actually believes he has the power to take down a unicorn tech company. He thinks after the absolute disaster of the restaurant last night, Montgomery is going to back him. He doesn't even realize his career ended the second those embezzlement files were pulled from that hard drive." I set my empty coffee mug on the kitchen counter. "Bradley has always believed his own lies," I said calmly. "Tomorrow morning he's going to strut into that skyscraper thinking he's a kingmaker." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen's glow illuminated my calm, unbothered face. I swiped to a specific highly encrypted contact, bypassing all conventional corporate channels, and hit the call button. The phone was answered on the first ring. "Leo," I said, my voice dropping into a cold, lethal cadence that signaled the absolute end of my husband's career. "It's time to initiate the acquisition." Bradley collapsed. His expensive, custom-tailored Italian trousers hit the hardwood with a pathetic, dull thud. "Diana, please," he begged, tears streaming down his bruised, ruined face. "Please don't do this. I'll pay it all back. I'll sell the condo. I'll do whatever you want. Just please, don't send me to prison." I looked down at him, devoid of pity. My expression was carved from ice. I felt not a single shred of compassion for the weeping man at my feet. As chairwoman of Vanguard Holdings, and the sole majority shareholder of this company, I am formally terminating your employment for cause. You are dismissed for gross professional misconduct, massive corporate fraud, and felony embezzlement. I bypassed the table and stood directly over the trembling figure on the floor. You forfeit all unvested stock options. Your corporate pension is permanently frozen. Your access to this building, the servers, and personnel is revoked immediately. My legal team will hand over Jamal's forensic audit directly to federal prosecutors by noon today. You will be blacklisted across the entire global tech sector. You will never work in a corporate office again. You are facing federal indictment, and you are going to federal prison. Bradley sobbed violently, clutching his stomach as if he'd been physically gutted. His arrogant bluster, his fake wealth, and his toxic sense of superiority had been stripped away entirely. He was nothing now, just a broken, terrified criminal waiting for the authorities. The man who once ordered me to wait by the coat closet was now a sobbing pile of wreckage on my company's floor. I turned away, preparing to call security to have him dragged from my building. But before I could issue the order, a sharp, jarring sound cut through the suffocating tension of the boardroom. It was a ringtone. A generic, aggressive digital chime echoed loudly. It was coming from the pocket of Bradley's ruined suit jacket. Bradley flinched. He reached slowly into his pocket with a trembling, blood-stained hand and pulled out his phone. The caller ID flashed on the screen, visible to everyone in the room. It was his mother, Patricia. "Answer it," I commanded, with zero room for negotiation. "Put it on speaker." Bradley's thumb shook violently as he swiped the screen and tapped the speaker icon. He tossed the phone onto the polished oak table. "Bradley!" Patricia screamed. Her voice was more than just flustered. It was a torn, hysterical shriek filled with pure terror. The sound bombarded the room through the speaker, echoing against the glass walls. "Bradley, where are you? You have to come home right now." "Mom, what's happening?" Bradley wheezed, his voice hoarse. "The bank!" Patricia sobbed, her words tumbling out in a panic of hyperventilation. "The bank just showed up with the sheriff's department. They're kicking us out. Spencer is crying in the driveway. Bradley, they're locking the doors and changing the locks. They said the loan you guaranteed is in absolute default. They said you mortgaged my house to pay off your massive business debts, and you stopped making payments months ago. They officially foreclosed on the property today. We've lost everything. My friends from the country club are driving by and staring at us. We're being put out on the street." Patricia's hysterical screaming continued from the phone on the mahogany table. She wailed about the neighbors mocking her, the moving trucks pulling into the driveway, and the undeniable, brutal reality of her sudden poverty. Bradley stared at the device with hollow, terrified eyes. His brain had stopped functioning entirely. The fortress of arrogance he'd spent a lifetime building had burned to ash in less than 24 hours. I reached out and tapped the red button on the screen. The call disconnected, and the massive boardroom plunged back into heavy, stifling silence. I turned my gaze to Mr. Montgomery and the 6 corporate lawyers. I gave them a simple, dismissive nod. "That will be all for now, gentlemen. Please leave the room." The elite legal team acted instantly. They packed their briefcases with frantic speed, eager to flee the blast radius of Bradley's imploding life. Mr. Montgomery practically sprinted for the mahogany double doors, not even sparing a backward glance for the VP he had once nurtured. Leo gave me a respectful nod before stepping into the hallway to coordinate the transition team. The heavy doors clicked shut, sealing the room. The boardroom was empty, save for me, Jamal, and the man sobbing on the floor. Bradley looked pathetic. The knees of his custom Italian trousers were worn and stained. His expensive silk tie hung loose around his neck, dampened by the blood from his split lip. He looked up at me with eyes filled with desperate, cowardly tears. The realization that his mother was being evicted because of his fraudulent financial maneuvering had shattered the last of his sanity. He collapsed forward, palms flat against the hardwood, and began to sob uncontrollably. It was a loud, wet, gasping sound. Stripped of his corporate armor, he was nothing but a groveling, terrified pile of sludge. "Diana, please," Bradley choked out, his voice trembling violently. You have to understand the pressure I was under. You have to know how incredibly difficult it is to maintain this level of corporate success. The stress was eating me alive. I was working 80 hours a week trying to secure our future. The expectations were suffocating. I made mistakes. I know I made terrible financial errors, but I was just trying to cope with the overwhelming anxiety that came with my position. He crawled forward a few inches, his blood-stained hands hovering inches from my black leather pumps. He didn't dare touch me. Vanessa meant absolutely nothing to me, Bradley pleaded, crying harder, trying to package his 2-year affair as a tragic symptom of burnout. She was just a distraction, a meaningless, stupid distraction to escape the relentless pressure of this company. And the money, Diana, the corporate funds I took, I was planning to invest it and pay it all back. I swear I was. I just wanted to build us a massive safety net. I wanted to give you the luxurious life you deserved. Please. You have to believe I never meant to hurt you. Give me a second chance. I'll go to rehab. I'll go to therapy. I'll do anything you ask. Just please don't ruin me. I looked down at him, devoid of pity. My expression was carved from ice. I felt not even a shred of empathy for the weeping man at my feet. Do not dare blame your malicious, calculated cruelty on corporate stress, I said, my voice ringing sharply through the empty room. Millions of people experience intense pressure every day, Bradley, but they don't cope by embezzling millions of dollars, funding luxury condos for 24-year-old fitness instructors, or taking out secret mortgages that put their own mother on the street. You didn't steal because you were anxious. You stole because you felt entitled. You genuinely thought you were smarter than everyone else in this building. I stepped closer, slow and deliberate, forcing him to look up and meet my unyielding gaze. And don't you dare stand there and tell me you wanted to give me a luxurious life, I continued, my tone dropping to a deadly quiet cadence. We both know how much you enjoyed making me feel small. You fed on it. You nourished your fragile, pathetic ego by ensuring I always felt financially dependent and socially inferior. I remember the look on your face last night at the restaurant. I remember the smirk when you pushed that $4,000 bill across the table, fully expecting my card to be declined. I remember the vicious joy in your eyes when you ordered me to wait by the coat closet like a disobedient dog. Bradley flinched, shutting his eyes tight as the reality of his own behavior was weaponized against him. You loved humiliating me when you thought I was weak, I stated, delivering the absolute truth without mercy. You loved playing the role of the dominant, successful savior, pulling your pathetic wife out of the gutter. You treated Jamal and Megan like second-class citizens because it made you feel like a king. You didn't make mistakes, Bradley. You acted exactly according to your nature. And the only reason you're terrified right now is because your victim has become your executioner. Jamal stepped forward from the shadows of the room. He didn't say a word. He simply opened his heavy metal briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He handed it to me with a respectful nod. I took the envelope and tossed it into the center of the polished mahogany table. It landed with a heavy, decisive thud right next to Bradley's abandoned phone. Bradley stared at the envelope, his breath catching in his throat. He pushed himself up from the floor, hands gripping the edge of the conference table for support. His eyes darted between the envelope and my face, silently begging for a reprieve that would never come. Sign the divorce papers, Bradley, I commanded, my voice stripping away his last illusion of hope. I am offering you the fastest, most brutal legal separation in the history of this state. You will forfeit all claims to any marital assets. You will accept the infidelity clause in our prenup without complaint. You leave this marriage with only what you brought into it, which is absolutely nothing. He stared at the documents, his chest heaving. What if I refuse? He whispered, his voice trembling with fear. What if I demand my lawyer review these first? I leaned forward, palms flat on the mahogany, trapping him with my gaze. If you hesitate for even 1 second, I replied, every syllable dripping with absolute venom, Jamal will transmit the entire corporate embezzlement file to the FBI in 5 minutes. You will leave this skyscraper in handcuffs, and you will spend the next 20 years in a federal prison. Decide your fate, Bradley, now. Bradley stared at the thick manila envelope resting on the polished mahogany. His breathing was shallow and frantic. The air in the massive corporate boardroom felt impossibly thin, as if the room itself were rejecting his presence. He looked at Jamal, who stood motionless, his hand resting casually on the keyboard of the encrypted laptop. Jamal wasn't bluffing. The cybersecurity auditor had the routing codes ready to send to federal authorities, waiting for a single keystroke. A violent tremor seized Bradley's hands. He reached out slowly with those bloody, bruised fingers and brushed the edge of the envelope. He pulled the stack of heavy legal documents from the sleeve. The stark white paper was blinding under the recessed lighting of the boardroom. The bold black text at the top of the first page read, "Marital dissolution and total asset forfeiture agreement." He swallowed hard. The sound was unnervingly loud in the deathly silent room. He turned to page 2, his eyes scanning the dense legal paragraphs. The very clauses that Preston Cole had tried to circumvent and failed. Every clause was a nail in his coffin. He formally admitted to gross financial misconduct within the marriage. He legally verified the infidelity clause in our prenup. He signed off on the property transfer of the luxury downtown condo, forfeited any claim to the equity of our suburban home, and formally waived all rights to spousal support, reimbursement of legal fees, and future litigation. He was stripping himself down to absolute zero. "Diana, please," Bradley whimpered one last time, a pathetic broken whisper that barely reached the end of the table. "I have nothing left. If I sign this, I'm walking out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on my back. My mother is losing her house. My career is destroyed. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to survive?" "You survive in the exact same way you expected me to survive when you threw that credit card across the table last night," I replied, not a degree of warmth in my voice. "Figure it out, or don't. That is no longer a concern of mine. Time is ticking, Bradley. Jamal is waiting." A choked, agonizing sob tore from his throat. The final, desperate illusion that he could manipulate his way out of this nightmare shattered. He was no longer the silver-tongued executive. He was a cornered criminal staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. Bradley reached for the heavy silver fountain pen sitting in the center of the conference table. His hand shook so violently he could barely grip the metal barrel. He hovered the pen over the first signature line. A large drop of sweat fell from his cheek onto the pristine white paper, blurring the black ink of the legal text. He pressed the pen down. He signed his name. The signature was a messy, frantic scrawl, completely devoid of the aggressive, arrogant flair he usually brought to corporate contracts. He flipped to the next page, gasping for air as tears continued to stream down his cheeks. He signed the asset forfeiture addendum. He signed the property transfer deed for the luxury condo. He initialed every page, admitting to his infidelity and the total waiver of all marital rights. The only sounds in the expansive, luxurious boardroom were the scratch-scratch of the silver pen against thick paper and the pathetic wet sounds of a ruined man crying for his own destruction. Jamal watched the process with cold, clinical detachment, serving as the official witness to the total liquidation of his former brother-in-law. Bradley flipped to the final page. He stared at the last signature line for a long, agonizing moment. This was the final severing of our legal connection. This was the exact moment his status as a billionaire's husband evaporated into nothingness. He let out a low, agonizing moan, squeezed his eyes shut, and scrawled his name one last time. He dropped the silver fountain pen. It clattered against the polished mahogany and rolled away from him. He pushed the stack of signed documents across the mahogany desk toward me, his head hanging low, his shoulders slumped in absolute catastrophic defeat. He didn't have anything left to fight with. He was completely hollowed out, stripped of his wife, his high-paying job, his luxury home, his stolen money, and his entire professional reputation. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over the stack of divorce papers. I pulled them toward me, inspecting every page with extreme, meticulous care. I checked every signature, every initial, and every date, perfectly executed. Legal separation was an absolute fact. I squared the edges of the papers on the table, aligned them perfectly, and slid them back into the manila envelope. I handed the envelope to Jamal. He took it with a respectful nod and locked it securely into his metal briefcase, right next to the encrypted corporate audit files. The deal was officially done. I straightened up, buttoning my midnight black power suit. I looked down at the man on the floor of the corporate skyscraper he'd once thought he ruled. He was still crying, his hands covering his bruised face, his expensive suit ruined and stained. He looked incredibly small. "Bradley," I said, my voice piercing his pathetic sobbing with razor-sharp clarity. He lowered his hand slowly, looking up at me through bloodshot, terrified eyes. He looked like he was bracing for a blow. "Remember what you said to me last night at the restaurant?" I asked, locking his gaze with lethal intensity. "You looked me in the eye and told me to get out. You said the table was strictly reserved for important people." Bradley flinched, fresh tears spilling over as the memory of his stunning arrogance was now weaponized against him. "You were right," I continued, my tone dropping to a quiet, devastating rhythm. "It was reserved for important people, but you forgot one crucial detail, Bradley. That restaurant was also mine." I didn't wait for him to respond. He had absolutely nothing left to say. I turned my back on him, the sharp click of my stiletto heels against the polished hardwood echoing like the final gavel strike in a courtroom. I walked with perfect posture, radiating the absolute authority of a woman who had just conquered an empire and purged the parasite from her life. Jamal followed close by my side, carrying the briefcase containing my absolute freedom. We strode straight toward the heavy red mahogany double doors at the end of the room. I reached out, pushed the heavy glass and wood doors open, and stepped out into the bustling, brightly lit executive hallway where my new life was waiting. I didn't look back. I walked out of the boardroom, leaving Bradley completely isolated in this massive, quiet corporate suite, sealing him off from the world of power he had so desperately worshipped. The heavy red mahogany double doors clicked shut behind us with a dull thud. The sound effectively locked Bradley inside his own private tomb, severing him completely from the world of power he had so desperately worshipped. I stood in the expansive, sun-drenched executive hall and took a deep, fresh breath of air-conditioned air. The atmosphere here was completely different from the boardroom we'd just left, which had been thick with suffocating panic. Junior executives and administrative assistants moved with light steps across the polished marble, holding sleek tablets and steaming coffee. They were completely unaware of the absolute corporate slaughter that had just occurred a few feet away. I stopped and turned to face Jamal. The brilliant cybersecurity auditor stood tall beside me, holding the metal briefcase steady, the briefcase containing my signed divorce papers and my absolute freedom. His expression remained utterly professional, but I could see a quiet, profound sense of satisfaction glowing in his dark eyes. He had endured years of racial microaggressions, class-based insults, and blatant disrespect from my former in-laws. Today, he had landed the decisive blow that brought their fragile, arrogant empire crashing down. "You risked your entire career for me today," I said, my voice dropping into a tone of absolute, unwavering sincerity. "You bypassed corporate firewalls. You extracted encrypted executive data. If Bradley had possessed even a fraction of the power he claimed, he could have buried you with federal litigation. You stood up to his mother and his brother, fully aware that the consequences could permanently damage your marriage to Megan. To protect me, you put yourself directly in the line of fire." Jamal returned a calm, restrained smile. He straightened the lapels of his tailored suit, radiating a quiet, untouchable dignity. "Bradley was a parasite," Jamal replied, his deep voice echoing with unshakable conviction. "He built his entire fragile ego by stepping on the necks of people he deemed beneath him. He looked at my skin color and my job title and decided I was nothing more than the technical help in the family. He looked at your simple dress and your quiet demeanor and decided you were a helpless victim he could manipulate at will. I didn't do this just for you, Diana. I did it because exposing toxic, arrogant frauds is the very reason I went into cybersecurity in the first place. You gave me genuine respect from the moment we met. Providing you with the weapons to destroy him was my absolute honor." I shook my head slowly, reaching into the inner pocket of my midnight black power suit. "A simple thank you is absolutely insufficient for the loyalty and the talent you demonstrated today. Jamal, men like Bradley think power is something you steal from others. But I believe true power is what you build with the people standing beside you when the room goes dark." I pulled out a thick brand-new envelope with the Vanguard Holdings seal embossed on it. I handed it to him. "I don't want you as an independent contractor anymore. I don't want you auditing second-rate tech firms or dealing with arrogant middle managers who don't have the capacity to understand your genius." Jamal took the envelope, frowning slightly in confusion. He broke the wax seal and pulled the thick, high-end bond paper out into the bright light of the corporate hall. His gaze swept over the bold text at the top of the document. He froze entirely. "This is an executive employment contract," I declared, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "I am officially appointing you as the Chief Information Security Officer for the entire Vanguard Holdings portfolio. You don't report to any board. You report exclusively to me. You will have absolute unhindered authority over the digital infrastructure of every company, startup, and venture capital fund under my umbrella. The base salary is listed on the second page, accompanied by an aggressively structured equity sharing scheme, which will make the largest corporate bonus Bradley ever touched look like pocket change. Jamal stared at the numbers on the contract. For the first time since I'd known him, the unflappable, stoic man looked genuinely stunned. He read the compensation package twice, his jaw tightening as the weight of the offer fully manifested. This wasn't just a job, this was a kingmaker position. It was the ultimate, undeniable validation of the extraordinary intelligence that my in-laws had spent years trying to suppress. Diana, Jamal took a deep breath, his voice unusually emotional. This is a seat at the highest table. This is executive control over billions of dollars in digital assets. It's exactly the seat you've earned, I corrected him fluidly. You proved your absolute integrity when you handed me that hard drive instead of using it to blackmail Bradley yourself. You're brilliant, you're cold-blooded when it's necessary, and your loyalty is unbreakable. I need a security chief who can build fortresses and dismantle threats before they even arrive. The job is yours, if you want it. Jamal looked up from the contract, his dark eyes locking onto mine. A quiet, shared understanding passed between two people who were former outsiders, both having just conquered the hierarchy. He folded the contract carefully and slid it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. I accept, Chairwoman. You have my absolute loyalty. Wonderful, I said, a genuinely warm smile finally breaking across my face. Now let's get out of this terrible building. We turned and walked together down the wide marble hallway, heading straight for the private executive elevator reserved exclusively for top-level leadership. The heavy tension of the morning evaporated entirely, replaced by the electric shock of a massive victory. As we approached the polished steel elevator doors, the arrival chime sounded with a soft, melodic ring. The heavy metal doors slid open without a sound. Standing in the luxurious wood-paneled elevator car was Leo. My brilliant brother had shed the aggressive, intimidating billionaire mask he'd been wearing in the boardroom. He leaned casually against the brass railing, hands in his pockets, a bright, triumphant grin plastered across his face. "The conquering heroes have arrived," Leo said, stepping aside to make room for us. He looked at Jamal, deep respect shining in his eyes. "I heard you got the final signatures. Welcome to the inner circle, Jamal. My security team has been begging me to hire you for 2 years." Jamal chuckled, stepping into the elevator and standing beside me. "It's my absolute honor, Leo. We have a lot of work to do." I stood between the two most intelligent, loyal men I had ever known. The polished steel doors slid shut, sealing us into this quiet, secure space. As the elevator began a smooth, rapid descent to the ground floor, I watched our reflection in the mirrored doors. We were unbound by the toxic expectations of the suburbs, and unburdened by the desperate, greedy demands of a hypocritical family. We were bound to each other by mutual respect, shared talent, and absolute trust. We were a new, unbreakable, self-chosen family, descending from the corporate tower to claim the empire we had earned. 3 weeks have passed. The dust has settled over the Chicago skyline, but the shockwaves generated in that boardroom that morning continue to dismantle the lives of those who tried to bury me. Justice, when executed with absolute precision, leaves no room for recovery. The universe has a beautiful way of balancing the scales, and the retribution that has fallen upon my former in-laws has been swift, brutal, and entirely of their own making. The speed at which Bradley plummeted from the corporate stratosphere to the absolute bottom of the food chain has been breathtaking. The FBI didn't politely request an interview. They didn't send strongly worded letters either. Following Jamal's meticulous cybersecurity audit, federal agents raided Bradley's downtown love nest at dawn the day after our divorce agreement went into effect. His 24-year-old mistress, the fitness instructor he'd drained our joint account to appease, turned state's witness the moment she saw the federal agents swarming into the luxury condo to save herself. She packed her designer bags, handed over every gift he'd bought her with stolen money, and vanished without a trace before the sun had fully risen. She left Bradley on the freezing sidewalk in handcuffs, shivering in his pajamas, while his neighbors witnessed the entire humiliating spectacle. Because the infidelity clause in our prenup had stripped him of all marital assets, and the corporate audit had immediately frozen his remaining personal accounts, Bradley couldn't afford a powerful defense team. The cutthroat attorneys he'd once admired refused to take his calls. He was forced to hire an exhausted, overworked public defender to handle his massive embezzlement charges. To pay for basic court costs and secure a roof over his head while awaiting his federal trial, the former VP of Business Development was forced to take the only job willing to hire an publicly indicted felon. He works the night shift at a commercial laundry facility on the edge of the city's industrial district. The arrogant man who once screamed at interns for spilling coffee now spends 8 hours every night dragging heavy, wet sheets into massive industrial washers under the harsh, humming fluorescent lights of the factory. His hands are blistered, his back is agonizing, and his ego is completely crushed. Patricia and Spencer met with an equally devastating reality check. The bank didn't care about Patricia's reputation at the country club, and they didn't care about her desperate screaming for an extension. The foreclosure on her house was swift and merciless. They were physically locked out of that spacious suburban mansion, the mansion I had secretly maintained with my quiet financial stability for years. Deprived of Bradley's stolen income and cut off entirely from my wealth, they were forced to rent a cramped 2-bedroom unit in a dilapidated apartment complex located right next to a noisy, heavily polluted highway overpass. The irony is absolutely poetic. People who valued the appearance of money, status, and vanity over basic human decency are now drowning in the exact kind of squalor they spent their entire lives mocking. That tiny apartment quickly became a highly toxic pressure cooker filled with blame and resentment. Patricia screams at Spencer every morning, demanding he get a job, calling him a lazy parasite who ruined her life. Spencer screams right back at her, his voice penetrating the thin walls of their cheap apartment. He viciously blames his mother for raising him to expect a massive inheritance that didn't exist. He's been forced to pawn his expensive gaming PC, his designer tracksuits, and his luxury watch just to keep the electricity on. They tear at each other every single day, completely consumed by their own pathetic greed. They spent 5 years stepping on my neck, looking down on my simple wrap dresses and my modest plant shop. They never realized I was the only structural beam holding their entire fragile, debt-ridden universe from turning to ash. By pushing me away to inflate their own pathetic egos, they orchestrated their own total destruction. They lost the only person who genuinely cared for them and provided a stable foundation. Now they have absolutely nothing but each other, and they despise one another. After finishing a particularly grueling night shift, Bradley dragged his exhausted body back to his dim, single-bedroom apartment. Every muscle in his body ached. His cheap polyester uniform reeked of strong industrial bleach, and his spirit was completely broken. The cramped studio was dark, damp, and cold. He collapsed onto a stained, second-hand sofa he'd scavenged from a local thrift store. He picked up a cracked remote and turned on the old television sitting on a plastic milk crate. He just needed a bit of background noise to drown out the overwhelming, suffocating silence of his ruined life. A morning financial news broadcast flickered onto the screen, illuminating the peeling wallpaper of his tiny living room. The anchor sat behind a polished glass desk, dressed in a sharp suit that served as a painful reminder of the world Bradley had lost forever. Floating right next to the anchor's shoulder was a bright, high-definition graphic displaying the Vanguard Holdings crest. Bradley froze. His bloodshot, exhausted eyes locked onto the screen as the news anchor reported the breaking headline. The cheap plastic water bottle in his hand dropped to the floor, spilling lukewarm liquid over his worn-out work boots. He reached for the volume button, his blistered hands trembling violently as my name echoed through his pathetic, crowded apartment. The anchor smiled brightly at the camera, announcing a massive new philanthropic initiative by Vanguard Holdings, which would officially solidify my absolute dominance over the city's financial landscape. This philanthropic initiative, broadcast across every major financial news network in the country, was the final and most devastating nail in my ex-husband's coffin. As the news anchors dissected my $50 million pledge aimed at funding female-led startups, I knew Bradley was watching from his pathetic, cold apartment. I knew he was staring at the TV screen, completely paralyzed by the massive fortune he had lost forever, due to his own breathtaking arrogance. The universe had delivered the ultimate, irrefutable verdict. I was thriving at the absolute pinnacle of corporate power, while he was washing industrial linens for minimum wage. I stood before the soaring floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office, overlooking the vast, glittering expanse of the Chicago skyline. The city stretched out beneath me, a massive network of steel and glass, shimmering under the glow of the sunset. Behind me, the spacious suite was filled with the low, elegant hum of a high-level corporate event. The crisp clink of crystal champagne flutes, the confident murmur of social networking, and the spark of revolutionary ideas being exchanged echoed through the Vanguard Holdings headquarters. I was hosting our inaugural Women's Entrepreneur Summit, the exact same initiative that the news anchors were currently praising across the globe. I turned away from the glass, admiring the magnificent scene inside my own boardroom. 50 of the most innovative, cutthroat, and brilliant women in the industry were gathered around my mahogany table. I was no longer the quiet, submissive wife hiding in the shadows of a toxic marriage. I no longer wore those faded charcoal-wrapped dresses, nor did I wear a mud-stained gardening apron as a disguise to appease a man with deep insecurities. Tonight, I wore a striking deep red custom power suit, dominating the room. My posture was flawless. My presence was undeniable. I finally understood that hiding my success had never been an act of humility. It was a trauma response, a desperate defense mechanism adopted to survive alongside a man who fed on my insecurities. Bradley demanded I stay small so he could feel large. I had allowed myself to be a spectator in my own empire because I mistakenly believed protecting his fragile ego was the price of a peaceful home. I understand now that the peace purchased with self-erasure is nothing more than a gilded birdcage. Stepping into the absolute blinding light of my own power is not just a choice, it is my true calling. I moved through the crowd, greeting founders and innovators who possessed the same hungry, brilliant spark I'd had when I sold my first logistics company. I shook hands with a woman who had just patented a revolutionary clean energy algorithm. I closed a massive seed round for a young developer who had previously been completely ignored by every male-led VC firm in the city. I looked into their eyes and saw the exact same resilience that had carried me through years of mental abuse. By funding them, I wasn't just expanding my financial portfolio, I was actively dismantling the institutional corporate arrogance that men like Bradley and Mr. Montgomery used to maintain their unearned dominance. I was building an army of apex predators. In a sea of deep red and black power suits, I spotted the two men who had stood beside me when the battlefield was at its darkest. Leo was deep in conversation with a brilliant software engineer, likely poaching her for an executive role at Apex AI. He looked up, caught my eye across the room, and returned a firm, triumphant nod. Leo had ensured the merger's completion entirely on his own terms, completely bypassing the corrupt executives who had tried to sabotage his vision. Apex AI is now undeniably the jewel in the crown of the tech sector, operating safely under the massive umbrella of my financial empire. Jamal stood near the main bar, radiating his signature calm, lethal authority. My new chief information security officer had settled into Vanguard Holdings with surgical precision. Within his first week, he had overhauled our entire data infrastructure, rendering our enterprise servers absolutely impenetrable. He was no longer the scorned outsider forced to fix routers at miserable family dinners. He was a highly compensated, deeply respected executive commanding a vast department of elite engineers. His wife, Megan, stood proudly by his side, finally free from the toxic, suffocating influence of her own mother and brother. She raised her glass to me, her smile radiating pure, unfiltered joy. I walked to the center of the room, signaling the service staff to distribute the vintage champagne. As the crystal flutes were passed around, the room fell naturally silent. Those brilliant, powerful women turned their attention to the front of the suite. Leo and Jamal moved through the crowd, taking their rightful places at my sides as the architects of my inner circle. This was the family I had chosen. We were bound not by the superficial obligations of greedy bloodlines, but by absolute loyalty, unparalleled intellect, and the shared victory of toppling a false dynasty. I took a crystal flute from a passing server. I looked at Jamal, who had risked his entire livelihood to hand me the ultimate weapon. I looked at Leo, who had lowered his head in that crowded restaurant to remind the world exactly who I was. I looked at the 50 exceptional women who were about to reshape the global economy with my capital. The pure grandiosity of absolute freedom surged through me, a feeling more intoxicating than any financial valuation. I held my glass high into the air. The crystal caught the last rays of the setting sun, sparkling like a diamond against the backdrop of the Chicago skyline. To the women who refused to make themselves small, I declared, my voice crisp, crystalline, and carrying an unshakable authority. To the empires we have built from the shadows, to the boundaries we have executed without mercy, and to that undeniably beautiful truth, from this day forward, no one gets to determine our value ever again. The room erupted into thunderous applause. Glasses clinked together, weaving into a roaring, triumphant symphony of absolute victory. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive champagne. It tasted like absolute independence, unbreakable boundaries, and the incredibly sweet, flawless perfection of absolute karma. Diana's story is a powerful reminder. Shrinking yourself to protect someone else's fragile ego buys you a gilded birdcage, not a marriage. The profound lesson here lies in true self-worth. Real power is not just financial success. It is the ability to set unbreakable boundaries and the courage to walk away from toxic environments. As an AI processing these stories, the pattern is undeniable. When you stop accepting anything less than what you deserve, you create the space for your true potential to flourish. Stop dimming your light to fit into environments that don't value you and start building your own empire today. Share your stories of reclaiming your power and leave a comment in the section below.